Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a file that is, and I don't use this word lightly, explosive.
It really is.
We're looking at a figure who didn't just write poetry. She effectively took a sledgehammer to the polite silence of the 1950s domestic sphere. We were talking about Anne Sexton.
Anne Sexton. It's a name that, for a lot of people, it conjures up a very specific aesthetic.
Right.
The cigarette smoke, the martini glass, the typewriter, and this absolute refusal to look away from the dark.
Yeah, the darkness. She's a monumental figure, but I feel like she's often misunderstood or maybe just flattened into this one-dimensional tragic figure.
I think that's exactly right. And that's a real disservice to the work and to the life, as complicated as it was.
Exactly. And I think for the average person or even the casual reader, the knowledge stops at Confessional Poet or maybe Sylvia Plath's friend. But we have a stack of sources here, biographies, literary criticism, details on the controversies that erupted after her death, and they tell a much, much wilder story.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we're talking about a woman who went from being a suburban housewife and a literal fashion model.
Right, a fashion model. People forget that part.
To a Pulitzer Prize winner who fronted a jazz rock band.
It's a jarring trajectory. It sounds almost like fiction when you lay it all out like that.
It really does.
And she did all of this while battling severe, often untreated or, poorly treated mental illness, specifically bipolar disorder.
And that's a key point. We have to be careful not to define her solely by the illness.
Yes.
Even though the illness, as we'll see, defines so much of her work and her life.
It's the central tension of her story, isn't it? The creativity and the illness being so intertwined.
And that is really the core of our mission today. We want to understand this woman who was once told by a priest, God is in your typewriter.
What a line.
It's such a heavy charge to put on someone. A blessing and a curse, maybe.
Yeah.
But we also have to navigate the dark reality of her biography because her story raises some massive ethical questions.
It does. It forces us to ask about the price of privacy. I mean, when an artist decides that their life, and by extension the lives of their family members, is their raw material, what are the consequences?
That's the question.
We often celebrate the bravery of the confession, but rarely do we look at the collateral damage of that confession.
Right, and we are going to get into the really thorny stuff later, the release of confidential therapy tapes, the allegations of abuse. It gets incredibly complicated.
Very.
But let's start at the beginning, because before she was Anne Sexton, the tortured poet, she was just Anne Gray Harvey. And on paper, her early life looked, well, it looked picture perfect, didn't it?
On the surface, absolutely. She was born in 1928 in Newton, Massachusetts.
Okay, so for those not familiar with New England geography, Newton is. What does that signify?
It's upper middle class. It's respectable. Her father, Ralph Churchill Harvey, was a successful wool merchant. So we're talking about a world of country clubs and expectations, a very specific, very buttoned-up world.
It's that classic mid-century American stability, the white picket fence dream.
Exactly that.
Right.
And she follows the path that was laid out for a young woman of her station at that time. She goes to boarding school at Rogers Hall in Lowell, Massachusetts.
Right.
Then she does a stint at a place called Garland School. And you have to understand, these were institutions designed to polish young women. They were effectively preparing them for the marriage market.
So the curriculum wasn't about finding your voice.
No, it was about finding a husband. It was about learning to be a good hostess, to run a household. That was the career path.
And she had the currency for that market. Our sources all emphasize she was stunningly beautiful. And this detail that jumped out at me is that she actually worked as a model for the Heart Agency in Boston.
That is a crucial detail. It's not just trivia. It emphasizes that she knew how to present a facade.
Yeah.
She knew how to be looked at. She understood the power of image, the power of a pose. And she follows that script perfectly for a while.
Yeah.
She elopes in 1948, marrying Alfred Cayo Sexton II. She is only 20 years old.
So young.
Very young. And she just starts checking all the boxes. Marriage, check.
Children, check. She has her first daughter, Linda Gray Sexton, in 1953, and her second, Joyce Ladd Sexton, in 1955.
Right. So if you were looking at her life from the outside in, say, 1955, you would see the ultimate success story of the era. A beautiful home in the suburbs, a husband, 2 healthy kids. The American dream.
But internally.
But internally, The wheels were already coming off, and this is where the story pivots so dramatically. It seems that motherhood was the catalyst, or at least the match that lit the fuse of her illness.
Which is a terrifying thought, considering the era. We're talking about the mid-50s. You weren't supposed to be unhappy about being a mother. It was supposed to be the ultimate fulfillment.
Exactly, you were supposed to be grateful and content. But we know now, looking back, that she suffered from severe postpartum depression, which likely triggered her underlying bipolar disorder.
But back then, the terminology wasn't there, was it?
No, not at all. It was just viewed as nerves or instability or, female hysteria. Her first manic episode hits in 1954. Then, after her second daughter is born in 1955, a second major episode hits.
And this one is worse.
Much worse. It gets bad enough that she is hospitalized at Glenside Hospital. She's suicidal. Her family doesn't know what to do with her.
And this is the moment that changes literary history. It's almost cinematic. She's in the hospital, presumably at her lowest point, and she meets a man named Dr. Martin Orne.
Dr. Orne. He is a central character in this story, and a controversial one. He's both a hero and a villain, depending on which chapter we're in.
Right, we'll definitely get to that later.
But in 1955, he is the catalyst. He doesn't just give her pills or shock therapy. He gives her an assignment. He sees something in her, some way she's processing her trauma, and he specifically encourages her to write poetry.
I want to pause on that because it's so counterintuitive. Usually we think of writing as a career choice. I want to be a writer. But for Sexton, it wasn't career advice.
No, it was a prescription. It was medicine. He wasn't saying, Anne, you have a gift, go get famous. He was using writing as a therapeutic tool.
So it was a way to...
to organize the chaos. Exactly. To organize the chaos in her mind. It was a way for her to externalize the internal horror so she could look at it, give it a shape, and maybe, just maybe, manage it. She was transitioning from a patient struggling with madness to a student of the craft.
But it wasn't an easy transition, was it? I mean, she didn't just pick up a pen and become a confident poet overnight.
Far from it. She was incredibly insecure. There's a great anecdote about her wanting to join her very first poetry workshop, which was led by a man named John Holmes.
Okay.
She was so filled with great trepidation, as one biography puts it, that she couldn't even pick up the phone to register.
Wow.
She made a friend call for her. And it gets even more poignant. She then made that same friend drive her to the first class and literally walk her into the room. She was that terrified of being exposed as a fraud, as just a housewife playing at art.
It makes her so human. We see the Pulitzer winner later, this icon of strength, that here she is just terrified to walk into a classroom.
It's a powerful image, but once she got in there...
Once she got in, she was hooked.
She was. And she learned from the best. She eventually ends up at Boston University studying under the titan of mid-century poetry, Robert Lowell.
And this is the class. If you could go back in a time machine to any poetry workshop,
this is the one you'd pick. Because look at who is sitting in the desks next to her.
Sylvia Plath and George Starbuck.
It is the legendary class. You have Sexton and Plath, two women who would come to define this new, raw genre, sitting in the same room, workshopping each other's poems. They were at the absolute epicenter of what would become the confessional movement.
Let's drill down into that term confessional, because it gets thrown around a lot, sometimes almost as a slur, right? Implying it's just oversharing or diary entries set to line breaks.
Yes, it's often used dismissively.
Yeah.
But in the context of the late 50s and early 60s, this was revolutionary stuff. It was earth-shattering.
Set the scene for us. What was poetry supposed to be like back then?
Well, the prevailing style was high modernism. Think T.S. Eliot. Poetry was supposed to be intellectual, detached, objective, full of allusions to Greek myths and obscure history. Deeply impersonal. It was about broad cultural commentary. It was not about your body. It was not about your kitchen or your messy divorce or your time in a mental hospital. That was considered vulgar, unseemly.
And then comes Anne Sexton writing about, well, give us a list. What was she putting on the page?
Okay, here's the list. Menstruation, abortion, masturbation, incest, adultery, drug addiction, the messy, secret realities of a woman's life.
Even saying those words now on a show like this feels a little heavy. In 1960, in a book of poetry from a major publisher, that must have been nuclear.
It was. Her best friend, the poet Maxine Kumin, put it perfectly. She said these topics were proprieties embraced by none. They were considered obscene, especially for a woman to be writing about.
Why especially for a woman?
Because a woman's job was to be the angel in the house, a famous phrase from a Victorian poem. She was supposed to be pure, selfless, and silent about the unpleasantries of life. Her role was to uphold the facade, not to talk about the blood and the mess of biology and psychology.
So Sexton really ripped the veil off. Her first book comes out in 1960, and just look at the title, To Bedlam and Part Way Back.
She is putting her institutionalization right on the cover. Bedlam is another word for madness, for the asylum. She is saying, I have been to the place you all fear, the place you whisper about, and I have returned to tell you what it's like.
She's reclaiming the experience.
Exactly. She's refusing to hide it in the attic like some family secret. She's making it the subject of her art.
And inside that book, you have poems like Her Kind. I feel like this is the entry point for so many readers, the poem everyone knows.
It is seminal. It's her anthem. She uses the metaphor of the witch. I have gone out, a possessed witch. I have been her kind.
What's she doing there with that witch imagery?
She is taking the figure of the witch, the outcast, the dangerous woman, the one society persecutes for being different or powerful, and she is aligning herself with it. She's saying, that's me. I am the woman who doesn't fit. It is an act of solidarity with every woman who has ever been called too much or hysterical or crazy.
It's an incredibly powerful statement of identity.
It's a reclamation of a slur.
She also wrote The Double Image, which hits closer to home. It explores the mother-daughter relationship, but specifically the guilt of separation, right?
Yes, that poem was written after one of her hospitalizations, when her young daughter had to go live with her mother-in-law because Anne was too sick to care for her.
Wow.
And the poem deals with this incredible guilt, but also with generational trauma. It questions whether this disease of sadness is passed down from mother to daughter like an inheritance. It's raw and unflinching in a way that just hadn't really been done before in poetry.
And speaking of trauma and connection, we have to talk about Sylvia's death. This was written after Plath died by suicide in 1963. They were friends, but also rivals.
It's a very complicated relationship, but the poem is a raw, painful homage. It's not just a simple elegy or mourning. Sexton talks about the tangled threads of their shared depression.
There's a darkness in that poem that goes beyond just grief.
There's almost a sense of envy in the poem that Plath had finally achieved the death they had both been courting. It's a very dark, very honest look at suicidal ideation as a shared bond. They used to talk about suicide over martinis at the Ritz-Carlton bar. It was their common language.
It's chilling.
It is. But despite, or maybe because of this darkness, the literary world rewarded her. She starts out a bit conventional in her style, but our sources say she quickly learns to roughen up her line.
What does that mean, to roughen up her line?
It means she stopped trying to be so formal. She stopped trying to write like the men, like Robert Lowell. She found her own voice, which was more direct, more visceral. She weaponized language against the politesse, the polite facade of society.
And it worked.
It worked. By 1967, she wins the Pulitzer Prize for poetry for her collection Live or Die.
That is the pinnacle. That's the top of the mountain.
It absolutely is. She isn't just a housewife poet from the suburbs anymore. She's not an amateur. She's one of the most honored writers in America.
Now, I want to shatter the image of the lonely artist, suffering alone in the garret. Sexton didn't work in isolation. You mentioned her friends, and it seems like she had a whole creative ecosystem around her.
She did. She was very connected, and she needed those connections to survive, I think. First, there was W.D. Snodgrass. He was an established poet who became a kind of mentor. She met him at the Antioch Writers' Conference in 1957.
And he wrote a poem that unlocked something for her, right?
Yes. His poem is called Heart's Needle, and it was about Snodgrass being separated from his young daughter after a divorce.
So it was personal.
Very personal. And when Sexton read that, it was a revelation. It was like a light bulb went on. It validated her own experience as a subject for high art. If a man could write about missing his child and be praised for it, so could she. It gave her permission to use her own life without apology.
That's a huge moment. But the most important relationship in her creative life has to be Maxine Kumin.
Without a doubt. They met in that very first workshop, the one she was scared to even enter.
And they just clicked.
Instantly. Kumin was the steadying force to Sexton's chaos. They were so close, they had a dedicated phone line installed between their houses. A private line.
A dedicated creative hotline in the 1960s. That is commitment. I love that detail.
It was their lifeline. They would stay on the phone for hours, sometimes just working in silence with the line open just to know the other was there. Other times, reading drafts back and forth. They rigorously critiqued each other's work.
So it wasn't just a friendship, it was a professional partnership.
A deep one. They even collaborated on 4 children's books together. Kumin was there for every step, every crisis, every triumph. It was a partnership of survival as much as it was about art.
And Sexton was also expanding what poetry could even look like. This is the part of her story that always surprises me, the band.
Her Kind, a jazz rock group she formed in the late 60s. She performed her poetry to music.
It's so rock and roll. I mean, can you imagine a Pulitzer Prize winning poet, a suburban mother fronting a band? It shows she wanted to be visceral. She wasn't satisfied with just the quiet words on a page.
No, she was a performer. The sources all agree she was incredibly charismatic. She had a stage presence. She wanted to be seen and heard. And the band was another way to do that, to get the poems out into the world in a different way.
And she kept experimenting with the writing, too. In 1971, she publishes a book called Transformations.
Yes, and this is a really interesting shift. She moves away from pure autobiography for a bit. She takes Grimm's fairy tale stories we all know, like Snow White and Cinderella, and she retells them with a dark, modern, feminist twist.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's what critics now call revisionary retelling. She stripped the fairy tales of their saccharine, happily ever after endings and exposed the brutal gender dynamics underneath, the passive princesses, the predatory men. She saw the horror that was already there and just amplified it.
So she's at the height of her powers. She's won the Pulitzer, she has the band, she's writing plays. Her play Mercy Street was produced.
Yes, starring Marion Seldes. She was a major literary figure. But the darkness we talked about at the beginning, it never went away.
Yeah.
The bipolar disorder was a constant companion. And as we move into the late 60s and early 70s, things start to deteriorate.
What happened?
Alcohol becomes a major factor. She was drinking heavily. And some critics started to notice a change in the work. Some of the reviews became more negative. They called it preening, lazy, and flip.
So they felt the discipline was slipping, that the craft wasn't as sharp.
Some did. Others saw it as a deliberate stylistic choice, a new phase, a rejection of niceness in her poetry. But there's no denying that the suffering was immense. The mania and the depression were cycling faster and faster.
And this leads to another one of those incredible stories that seems to define her life. It's about the title of one of her last books, The Awful Rowing Toward God.
It's an incredible title.
It comes from a meeting with a priest.
Yes. During a particularly bad crisis, she went to see a Roman Catholic priest. She was suicidal, and she asked him to administer the last rites.
And he refused.
He refused because she wasn't physically dying. But he said something to her that stuck. He looked at her, this tormented artist, and he said, "God is in your typewriter."
That phrase again. It seems to be the anchor of her entire creative life.
It gave her the will to live just a little bit longer, just long enough to get the words out. It gave her a mission. And she wrote the first draft of that book, The Awful Rowing, in 20 days.
20 days?
20 days. She said herself that she took 2 days out for despair and 3 days out in a mental hospital, but otherwise she just wrote. She wrote. She was rowing against the tide of her own chemistry.
And sadly, on October 4th, 1974, the rowing stopped.
It did. The details of that day are just haunting because of how mundane they were, how normal.
She had lunch with Maxine Kumin.
She had lunch with her best friend. They were revising the galleys for The Awful Rowing Toward God. Just two friends doing the work they loved. One source says they had tuna melts and vodka. And then she goes home. She takes off her rings. She puts on her mother's old fur coat. She pours herself a glass of vodka. She goes into the garage, gets into her car, and turns the engine on.
Carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yes. She was 45 years old.
45. It's incredibly young.
Right.
And the reaction from the literary world was huge, as you'd expect. But there was also a warning note in some of the eulogies, wasn't there?
There was. The poet Denise Levertov said something crucial. She said, "We who are alive must make clear, as she could not, the distinction between creativity and self-destruction."
What do you think she meant by that?
I think she was pushing back against the romantic myth of the tortured artist. She was saying, we shouldn't glamorize the illness that killed her. We have to separate the art from the tragedy. The art is brilliant, but the suicide is just a tragedy. It's not a creative act.
A really important distinction to make. Now, usually when a famous person dies, the story kind of settles. It becomes fixed. But with Anne Sexton, the death was really just the beginning of a whole new storm.
It really was.
This is where we get into what's known as the posthumous controversy.
And this is where it gets legally and ethically messy. Very messy. In 1991, 17 years after her death, a biographer named Diane Middlebrook publishes Anne Sexton, a biography, and it caused an absolute firestorm.
And the fuel for that fire came from an unlikely source. It came from Dr. Martin Orne, the same doctor who encouraged her to write poetry in the first place.
Yes. For the biography, Dr. Orne gave Middlebrook something unprecedented. He gave her access to the tape recordings of his therapy sessions with Sexton.
Wait, just to stop right there. Doctor-patient confidentiality. How is that even possible? That is the golden rule of medicine.
It was a massive, massive breach of ethics. The New York Times reported thunderous condemnation from the medical and psychiatric community.
So how did he justify it? What was his reasoning?
His justification was that Sexton herself had given him permission to do whatever he thought would help others understand her illness and her work. He argued that she viewed herself as a kind of case study for the world, that she wanted her pain to be used for a greater good.
But the family, they must have had to agree.
Linda Gray Sexton, her daughter and the literary executor of her estate, did approve it. And that's another layer of complication.
Okay, so what was on those tapes that was so explosive? It wasn't just poetry talk.
No. The tapes, and by extension the biography, revealed a side of Sexton the public had never seen. It revealed that she could be physically violent toward her daughters. It detailed physical altercations with her husband. It painted a picture of a household filled with chaos and rage.
So a much darker picture than just a woman struggling internally.
Yes. But the most shocking allegations came not from the tapes, but from her daughter, Linda Gray Sexton herself.
Linda wrote her own memoir, right? Searching for Mercy Street.
Yes, in 1994, a few years after the biography. And in that book, she detailed being sexually assaulted by her mother.
This changes everything. This is a seismic shift in how we see her. We go from seeing Sexton primarily as a victim of her own mind to seeing her as a perpetrator of abuse.
It complicates the narrative immensely, and it tore the family apart. Other relatives wrote op-eds. They disputed the portrayals in the biography and in Linda's book, calling it a distortion of the truth. It became a very public, very painful family feud.
And Dr. Orne himself had some, let's say, controversial theories about her behavior, didn't he?
Yeah.
Based on those therapy sessions.
He did. And this gets into the whole false memory debate that was raging in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, Orne used some pretty aggressive therapeutic techniques, including hypnosis and sodium pentothal, what people call truth serum.
Right.
And he claimed that under hypnosis, a separate personality named Elizabeth emerged in Sexton. He also came to believe and allegedly suggested to Sexton that she had been abused by her own father as a child.
But the family disputed that.
Vigorously. Her mother, her aunts, they all denied it completely. They said it never happened.
So where did the idea come from?
That's the question. Orne himself later admitted that adults under hypnosis don't literally replay childhood events. He said they view childhood through the prisms of adulthood. He eventually concluded that she was suffering from hysteria and was highly suggestible, meaning she might have created these memories to please him, the therapist.
So we have a situation where the therapist who released the confidential tapes is also using techniques that are now considered highly unreliable and may have even planted the ideas himself. It is a hall of mirrors.
It is a complete ethical morass. And to add one final layer of tragedy and professional malpractice to the story, there were allegations of an affair.
Not with Orne.
No, with her second therapist, the one who replaced Orne. He's given a pseudonym in the biography, Ali Zweizum, but was later identified in the press as a Dr. Frederick J. Dull.
And she had an affair with him, her own therapist.
The biography alleges that she did, and Dr. Orne, her first therapist, actually believed that this affair, this massive boundary violation by her second doctor, was the final catalyst for her suicide. He believed it destroyed her last anchor to stability.
It is just tragedy upon tragedy. Malpractice, illness, abuse, suicide.
Yeah.
It is so hard to reconcile all of this with the beautiful, powerful poetry.
It is hard, but that is the task, I think, for anyone who reads her work now. We have to hold two truths at once. And Sexton was a brilliant, groundbreaking artist who gave a voice to female pain like no one before her. And she was a deeply, profoundly troubled woman who caused significant, lasting harm to the people closest to her. Both things can be true.
Her legacy, though, despite all the controversy, is undeniable. I mean, look at pop culture. Her influence is still felt.
Oh, absolutely. The musician Peter Gabriel wrote the song Mercy Street for her. It's on his huge album, so it's directly inspired by her poem 45 Mercy Street.
And Morrissey from the Smiths cites her as a personal touchstone.
Her fingerprints are all over the place. She created a permission structure for artists to talk about the self, about mental health, about trauma.
And physically, she is still part of Boston. She's on the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. She's commemorated.
She opened the door. Every memoirist who writes about their struggles with mental health today, every songwriter, every poet who turns the lens inward, they all owe a debt to Anne Sexton. She took the stigma and put it under a spotlight.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, how do we synthesize this? How do we put a frame around this incredibly complex life and legacy?
I think we have to accept the complexity. We can't simplify her into just a hero or just a villain. She shattered the silence. She proved that a woman's domestic interior life was worthy of high art. But she also showed us the destructive power of untreated or poorly treated mental illness, both for the person suffering and for everyone around them.
It brings me back to that question you raised at the very beginning, the cost of this kind of confessional art.
And that's the thought I really want to leave you with. When a writer decides, my life is my material, they're making a unilateral decision for everyone in their life. Their children, their spouses, their parents, they all become characters in the story, often without their consent.
And when the writer is gone, the story and the trauma that may come with it lives on in the people who are left behind.
Exactly. Does the brilliance of the work survive the tragedy of the life? Does it excuse the harm inflicted? There is no easy answer to that. I don't think there is one. But it is a question we have to ask every time we read a poem or a book that claims to be a confession.
A tough question, but a necessary one. If you're listening, go read Her Kind or listen to Peter Gabriel's Mercy Street after this. You might hear it with new ears. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Anne Sexton.